On a scale of Emu War to invading Russia during the winter, just how successful was Prohibition? Hey history heroes, I'm Tempest and welcome to Time with Tempest, where today we're going to be talking about Prohibition. Specifically, how did everyone get their alcohol during Prohibition? For more hidden history like this, subscribe to my channel and keep updated with all the latest history I uncover. Now, let's begin our story. Let's take it back to the 1800s when the Prohibition movement really kicked off. Now we all know there's a separation of church and state, but that's never really stopped the government before or after, has it? The American Temperance Society, formed in 1826, and the Women's Christian Temperance Society, formed in 1873, were leading the crusade for Prohibition. WCTS described themselves as a union of women from all denominations for the purpose of educating the young, forming a better public sentiment, reforming the drinking classes, transforming by the power of the divine grace those who are enslaved by alcohol, and removing the dram shop from our streets by law. By the 1900s, the movement had gained momentum, and many politicians from more religious, rural areas where temperance was common were now in Congress. Another factor also came into play: World War I. Some argue that by eliminating alcohol, more grain could be used for the war effort. And while the war ended before Prohibition was made legal, it propelled the movement into the forefront of America. In December 1917, Congress passed a resolution for a constitutional amendment to make Prohibition legal. A little over a year later, 38 states out of 48 had ratified it, making it legal. After that, most states followed suit, except for Rhode Island and Connecticut. Finally, on October 28, 1919, Congress officially created the 18th Amendment, making Prohibition legal starting January 17, 1920. America was still divided on the issue, and the rest of the world's reaction was not great. Upon returning to the UK after touring Canada, Edward, Prince of Wales, son of King George V, relayed to his father a song he heard sung in a bordering town. 24 Yankees, feeling very dry, went across the border to get a drink of rye. When the rye was opened and the Yanks began to sing, God bless America, but God save the King. Speaking of Canada, you must be thinking, golly gee, now that alcohol's gone, everyone must be perfect Christians. The Temperance Society solved alcoholism and violence all in one foul swoop. Not. Prohibition caused a booming business in the illegal import and export of beer and liquor, with the majority coming from Canada. Producing at home was dangerous. The government poisoned industrial alcohol so it could not be turned into drinking alcohol. Nevertheless, it caused the deaths of over 10,000 people. Yet the violence was on both sides, because the flow of smuggled alcohol was controlled by gang members and in fact caused more violence than it had pre-Prohibition. People who ordinarily wouldn't commit crimes turned to bootlegging as a way to put food on their family's table during the Great Depression. And petty criminals soon found themselves forced into business with violent gangs, which usually ended with a bang. Those gangs thrived during Prohibition, creating crime syndicate empires within months that would have taken years pre-Prohibition. Now, there were ways to get alcohol legally. Certain doctors would prescribe whiskey for medical reasons, and of course, a small fee. But for the most part, bootleggers and rumrunners were the foremost purveyors of alcohol in America. Of course, law enforcement was ramping up to deal with the ever-growing problem, but whether it was by land or by water, people found ways of getting around the law. Literally. A vast majority of alcohol was smuggled into America using water. It came from Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Lakes like Lake Champlain and rivers like the Connecticut River provided easy access from Canada to the United States. Let's take a closer look at these case studies. On Lake Champlain in Burlington, Vermont, Smugglers were making a killing bringing alcohol from Canada to the US during Prohibition, where patrol boats were almost non-existent. But 4 years later, US Customs decided to try and cut the head from a hydra. From 1924 to 1933, they funded the Lake Champlain Boat Patrol. This was in an effort to control the ever-booming smuggling operation on Lake Champlain. Armed with a handful of boats and a 3-man crew for each, the officers would take turns listening for the sound of the smugglers' boat engines on the water. Most often, the smugglers were able to give them the slip because they had more powerful, pimped-out boats. One of the more infamous smugglers, a man named Snyder, had jury-rigged 2 World War I airplane engines to a converted lifeboat, enabling him to evade any who attempted to arrest him. One hull he was suspected of supplying was seized by the patrol, and it contained 9,600 bottles of Canadian beer and ale. They were always packed in bran sacks to protect them from breaking and to provide an easy offload into the water just in case they were weighing the boat down during a chase. Sadly for Snyder, his confiscated large load was destroyed by packing the sacks onto a barge, sailing out to the middle of the lake, and breaking every bottle with axes and hammers, dumping them into the water. So if you ever find sea glass on the banks of Lake Champlain, you may be holding history in your hands. The Connecticut River was a different story entirely. Being connected to the ocean provided multiple ways of receiving alcohol from all over the world. Rum Row was in international waters in the ocean, just 12 miles offshore, where the US government could not enforce their laws. Ocean steamers carrying huge amounts of alcohol from Mexico and the Caribbean anchored in this zone and offloaded onto small speedboats, which then raced through Long Island Sound and sometimes up the river. Submarines were also used, as were vessels registered to foreign governments to avoid responsibility if they were caught smuggling. The Coast Guard was no match for the speed of the rumrunners. They began to use machine guns and fired on the smugglers, causing what were called sound battles. They were extremely overzealous, killing numerous bootleggers without so much as a warning, and firing upon civilian homes on shore. But despite everything, the speedboats were undeterred, and many boats were undamaged thanks to their well-armored plating. Another reason for their success was their location. Remember, Connecticut and Rhode Island refused to ratify the 18th Amendment and were basically dragged kicking and screaming into Prohibition. Many citizens were sympathetic to the rum runners and more than willing to help with their endeavors, to the tune of a few bottles of booze. There were also large estates along the coastlines that bought expensive European-produced alcohol in bulk from the smugglers for their Gatsby-esque parties. Then the Coast Guard came up with a brilliant idea. Assign one of their own government boats to watch Rum Row just out of international waters and arrest anyone just as soon as they reach Connecticut waters. Except for the rampant corruption that happened when the rum runners bribed the government officials for a free pass to the shoreline. In the mid-1920s, this was discovered during the bust of the largest rum ring in the history of Prohibition at that time, when hundreds of government officials managed to arrest key figures that formed the backbone of Rum Row, and several of their own government officials for corruption. Oops. Also arrested was the de facto owner of Rum Row, Big Bill Dwyer, a multi-millionaire sportsman, gangster, and society bootlegger from Long Island, who was accused of having the largest and most efficient smuggling ring known to history. During his arraignment, prosecutors maintained that not only was he bribing officials at sea, but also at the mouth of the Connecticut River, where his boats could make deliveries at multiple ports. Just like many bootleggers, Big Bill was at it again after his short jail sentence, and he and others continued to smuggle alcohol into America until the end of Prohibition in 1933. This end came about for several reasons. At this point in time, the Great Depression was hitting America hard, and tax revenue plummeted. Prior to Prohibition, taxes on alcohol had taken up 14% of federal, state, and local tax revenue. By making it legal again, it would help deal with the ongoing crisis and alleviate the suffering of millions of Americans. Additionally, a presidential campaign was happening in 1932, and the Democratic candidate promised to end Prohibition if elected. And indeed he was. And indeed he did. Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an amendment on March 1933 allowing the sale of beer and wine, famously remarking, "I think this is a good time for a beer." Same. He also encouraged the ratification of the 21st Amendment, and by December of that year, it was ratified, and the 18th Amendment was officially repealed. Prohibition had officially ended, and the lakes, rivers, and oceans that once harbored booze and bootleggers were back to their calm, peaceful states. Some smugglers went into legitimate businesses selling alcohol, and others, like Big Bill, retired from the booze business and settled down with their families. In the end, no one can agree on whether Prohibition helped or hindered America. But one thing is for certain, we got some good stories out of it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more hidden history, make sure to subscribe, distribute your delight, or leave your calling card in the comments below because the YouTube algorithm gods demand it. Until next time, stay curious, history heroes.